Today, I am cutting up Dream Big panels to make one bigger, more beautiful flower. It will work with any color, so grab your favorite Dream Big panels and let's get started. I love these gorgeous Dream Big panels, but they are a little tricky to use. They're a bit of an odd size. They're 40 inches square, which makes sense since they're a square panel and a width of fabric is 40 inches. But that makes them a difficult size for a quilt. A 40-inch quilt is great for a baby, but if you want to use it as an adult or even as a child, then we really need to make these panels bigger. And you can add a border, certainly, to the edge of your panel, but then there's a harsh line between the printed panel and that solid border. And that's fine. I've seen a lot of really gorgeous quilts that way, but I wanted to challenge myself to come up with a better way to make these panels bigger. So I have 3 of them in front of me, and they're all 3 the same. I don't know exactly how many I'm going to need for this project, but I'm hoping it will be 2 and I have the 3rd for insurance, but it might very well be 3. Time will tell. In addition to our panels, you are also going to need some paper-backed fusible web. I have Wonder Under here, which is a Pellin product, but there are others. You just need to make sure that you get the kind with paper because we are going to use a fusible applique method to combine these panels into one. The first thing I need to do is fuse the back of my panels with Wonder Under. And the Wonder Under is 20 inches wide and these panels are 40. So you will need to butt 2 pieces up against each other to cover the whole piece of fabric. And I'm going to go ahead and do that with 2 panels and reserve the 3rd one as a backup. 2 strips of the fusible web didn't quite cut it, so I actually had to cut another length and cut that in half the long ways. And I was able to reuse the other half on the second panel, so it worked out rather well, but it did take more than the 2. So I have my very crinkly Dream Big panel all prepped with the backing on it. So now that it is all fused, I am going to peel off the paper backing, and then we're going to cut up this panel. So as you peel your paper backing off, you are looking for really good adhesion of the fusible web to your fabric. When you peel back that paper, and mine is not coming off well. I've obviously missed a couple of spots, like the paper is coming off here, and I can tell that the fusible web it's slightly sticky. I guess it has like a rough texture, a little bit of a bumpy texture, and I can tell that it's not adhered to the fabric. So I'm going to take this back over to the iron and press it a little bit more and then try to peel off that paper backing. Well, I am not going to lie. That was not my favorite part of any project I have ever done. So I don't think that I did a really great job of getting my fusible web to actually fuse to my fabric. I don't think I pressed long enough, even though it felt like I was pressing forever. But be sure to read the instructions on your fusible web to make sure that you get a really nice fuse, because that web is going to hold our pieces of our flower panel in place until we can get them stitched down. So I'm not terribly worried about not having a really great fuse on the back of my fabric. It was more just frustration peeling the paper off. But now we are ready to go on to the next step, which is cutting our panel apart. So I'm going to cut each of these petals out separately so that I have a bunch of petals to rearrange and combine to make one larger flower. So I have my trusty scissors here. You could use a rotary cutter if you are more comfortable with that. So I'm going to start on the outside and work my way in, just cutting these petals apart as they show up in the fabric. Some of the petals aren't exactly obvious where they begin and end. Use your best judgment, and it will all blend together in the end. Well, that took a lot longer than I anticipated, but I am done. I have all of these petals here, and I also saved the 2 centers. I think one turned out a little better than the other. This was the second one, and I knew I already had a good one, so I kind of mangled this one in the name of speed. My petals range in size from quite small all the way up to medium and some very large ones. There are also some that are very oddly shaped, like this one, but I am keeping this because you never know when you need a little piece to tuck behind another petal. So I think I'll still get some use out of these weirdly shaped petals. I also kept all of my scraps, and these are just the very outer bits of the panel, but I think some of them are sizable enough that if I need a little bit of a petal to fill in a hole or something, I'll be able to get it out of this. So some of the petals on the panel are just slightly cut off by the edge of the panel, but most of the petal is still really usable. So for those, I just faked the edge of a petal and cut it off so that it was still usable in my arrangement that I'm going to do. I still have my third panel here. I haven't cut it up yet. I haven't even interfaced it. I am hoping that I won't need it, but I have it just in case. So the next step is to make a piece of fabric for all of these to be fused and sewn onto. And I have stuck it behind me. I have this Moda Grunge that I think I'm going to use. It's neutral. I think this combined with the red petals with a little bit of green will be nice and Christmassy. So I have a couple yards of this. I am going to cut off maybe a 65 inch length, cut 2 of them, and seam them just like I would for the backing of a quilt. That's basically what we're making. We're just going to use it on the front. So 2 large lengths, seam them together along the selvage, and then press that selvage open. You can remove the selvage if you want. I am a rule breaker and I leave it on, but that is up to you. I'm going to go ahead and make my giant rectangle of fabric out of this. And that is the only sewing. That one seam is the only sewing that we're going to need to do for this top. The rest of it is all going to be quilting. It's finally time to arrange our petals, and I started first by sorting all of my petals into a couple of different piles according to size. I have my really tiny ones, a couple of medium piles, the really large piles, and then I have another pile just for the really weirdly shaped petals. I started in the center. I found the center of my fabric by using the seam on the one side and then folding it in half the other way and just pressing a little X in the center so I could put the center of my petal flower right over that mark so that my flower would be centered on this big panel. And then I just started arranging my petals. I started with the small ones and tucked them behind that center motif, and then started adding larger and larger petals, going around, tucking them behind, and trying to fill it out as evenly as possible. I used some pins to secure everything just to make it a little bit easier to move this panel of fabric around so that I could tuck petals without disturbing all of the other petals that I was working with. This was definitely the most difficult part of making this quilt, just making sure that it looked like a flower, that it was growing evenly out from the center, and making sure that all the petals were tucked behind each other and finding the right place for each petal. There was just kind of some trial and error going on, and I did end up reshaping some of the petals, cutting off some corners and rounding them just so they would fit a little bit better in the place that I had them. As I worked around, this did get fairly large, and once I had all of the medium-sized petals in place and pinned, I actually ended up moving it to the floor so that I could really spread it out. So I have added the last round of petals around the outside of the flower and pinned everything in place to secure it until I can get it to an ironing surface and fuse all of the web that is on the back of the flowers. I'm pretty happy with it. My 2 panels combined made a flower that is about 55-ish inches across both ways. And that's with 2 40-inch panels. If I had added a third, I bet I could have gotten it like a full 65 or so across. And I think that you could add as many panels as you want during this process to make your flower as big as you would like. But I think I've achieved the look that I want. I have this floating flower on my background fabric, and now I am going to load it on the long arm and do raw edge applique around all of these petal edges. So here we are. I have my quilt all loaded onto the long arm, and you can probably guess by how my petals are all flopping in different directions and the pins are still in that I did not actually use an iron to fuse all of these petals in place. I did that for a couple reasons. One, and the most important reason, was that my fusible web was just so poorly applied, so poorly affixed to my fabric panel, that most of the petals didn't really have any fusible web on the back of them at all. So the second reason, and kind of a corollary to that, was that I was hoping to see if the fusible web was really necessary to finish a applique project like this. I am hoping that my end result will be that the edges of these petals fray slightly so that they create a bit of a 3D texture to this quilt. So I am going around each petal and stitching about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch around the edge of each piece, removing the pins as I go. Now, I am not being super fussy in this process because I know that I will be going around each petal again during the more detailed quilting. I'm hoping to have multiple outlines on each petal to hold them in place and prevent fraying of the petal fabric down into the quilt past the stitching lines. So I'm not being particularly careful on that first pass. I'm just going slowly to get it all down, and then I'm going back around, as you can see, adding multiple additional rows of stitching around each piece. Once it was time to quilt the interior of each of these petals, I chose to do a feather in each petal. I did some large pebbles in the center of the flower and then did my big freehand feather in each of the petals. I did give myself a little bit of a chalk outline to follow just so I could make sure that I was keeping my feathers in the right proportion to the petals I was sewing them in. But other than that, these are all freehand. Now, there are a million different ways to quilt a dream big panel, and there are hashtags on Instagram to give you a little bit of inspiration, but you can quilt down these petals however you would like. And I just happen to choose feathers because I really like quilting feathers. Some of my petals had been stitched around just once, and some had been stitched around several times. So I did go ahead and make sure that all of the edges of the petals were nicely secured with at least 3 rounds of stitching. This was a pretty thread-heavy project, and I think the results are worth it, but keep in mind you'll be filling and changing bobbins pretty frequently. You can see here that the edges of my petals are already starting to fray just from working with the quilt and running my machine over it. And this is just the look that I was going for, so I was really pleased to see this happening. If you do want a really clean-edged applique look to your petals, then you are probably looking at turning the edge under and hand sewing them down, or relying on that fusible web to really hold those edges down. I didn't do either because I was looking for that almost rag finish look to this quilt, and I'm also not really paying attention to how neatly I am stitching because I know that those frayed edges are going to cover up a lot of sins. I know a lot of my stitching is sped up, but this is actually real time. These feathers are really fast for me to do, so that's why I chose them. And because I was not being particularly careful about how the edges looked, that allowed me to go even faster. So if you're looking for a quick way to finish a flower panel like this, then big bouncy feathers are a great option. Once I finished quilting all of these petals, I filled in the background with just a large, loopy, all-over design that kind of came out from behind the flowers. You'll see it in just a moment when I show you the finished product, but I didn't actually get any footage of me quilting it. You could fill it in with any edge-to-edge or all-over quilting design that you liked, or you could even fill it in with additional feathers. Whatever design you think would look great is a fantastic option. I did all of the quilting for this quilt on my long arm, but I did save one petal here to do on my regular sewing machine to show you how the process and the results may differ slightly. And I think the results are very, very similar. You could make this entire quilt on your regular sewing machine. It would be slightly easier to do if you did take the time to fuse all of your petals down. I skipped that step because my fusible web process didn't go very well, but it would let you avoid dealing with all of those pins in your way while you were quilting on a regular sewing machine. So as always, my sewing is sped up just so I can show you enough sewing, but here I am in real time stitching these feathers. I am a slow free motion quilter, especially on my regular machine, and that is okay. So go as slow as you need to go. So the process is the same. I go around the petal a couple of times just to establish that nice sewn border so that any fraying I have doesn't fray into the body of my petal. And then I begin the same feathers. I am working on these without a center spine drawn on the petal, but if that helps you feel more confident in your feathers, then you can certainly take the time to draw a little guideline or even stitch a guideline if that is how you prefer to do your feathers. Since these are small, I prefer to just take the shortcut and freehand them. Reach the tip of your feather, then you can either tie off here or use the lines of stitching to move to the next feather. My quilt has been quilted and bound and washed, and I have some good news and some bad news. The good news is that the raw edge applique look that I was going for totally succeeded. I love how each of the petals has this little frayed edge. I think it makes the petals of the flower really stand out and helps both of those panels really come together as a cohesive single flower. The multiple lines of stitching I put around each petal are really secure. The fraying that I see is not even extending all the way to the outermost line of stitching, and even if that outermost line fails, there are still multiple lines of stitching to hold each petal in place without it fraying into the body of the petal and having the entire petal fray and fall apart on the quilt. I washed this quilt on extra hot water with high agitation and machine dried it on high. Quilts in my house don't get any special treatment, so this one has definitely been pretty well tested. It's actually been washed twice and dried once now. So I feel pretty good about this technique and how it will hold up long term in your quilts. The bad news is that I used a gorgeous Kona red wideback on this quilt, and I cut my binding strips from the same fabric, and it bled mercilessly onto my white fabric. From some of these shots, it isn't very obvious just how bad it is, but once you see this shot, which is the original white fabric, my leftovers up against the washed background of this quilt, you can see just how pink the quilt is. So even with the bleeding, I'm still really glad that I made this quilt. I think the raw edge applique is fantastic and something that I'll definitely be using again in the future. So I would love to hear in the comments if you have ever done raw edge applique and what you thought of the process. Do you like the raggy kind of frayed edge look, or do you think it's terrible and you would much rather do needle turn applique to have that nice clean edge? I have never successfully finished a needle turn applique project, but you never know. Maybe that'll be in the coming 2022 season. If you are looking for some other holiday quilt ideas, there is my holiday quilt from last year, which uses just a layer cake popping up on the screen, as well as another video that you might enjoy. Until we meet again, happy quilting!